they're ruining the language with their slang and they don't know how to talk anymore, texting and emojis. And it's just like every single generation has been like, those new ones are ruining the language. What name you call somebody by does reflect a lot about your attitude towards them and often like status, right? Language and culture are intertwined. It's very hard to learn a language without also learning something about the culture. One of the big things is having people respect your identity by using an old name that suggests that they're not acknowledging the change. There's a gender that you previously weren't. So I'm Zenzi Griffin. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the psychology department. But because I study language, I also have appointments in linguistics and speech, language, and hearing sciences. What I mostly study is I'm interested in how people speak. Like, I got into it first through questions like, okay, if you're bilingual, how are you choosing which language you want to use, and what does it mean to feel like you're thinking in two languages, or a language that you've just kind of learned. But at the time, the bilingual literature just wasn't appealing. And then I realized, it's amazing that we can even speak our first language, right? There's just so much going on. And so I became interested in just trying to figure out, okay, what goes behind being able to form sentences and get them out in real time. And so I did 1 year of studying psychology full-time at Stockholm University, and then transferred to Michigan State University, where I got my bachelor's in psychology. Then I went to University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign to study, then get a degree in psychology. And I went straight from there to be a professor at Stanford University, from there to Georgia Tech, and I've been at UT for 17 years now.
That's incredible, and it's such a fascinating thing because the more I looked into a lot of your work, the more I was starting to understand is like the way that we speak language can also inform narrative building on how we form an identity of ourselves. And so I think there's a couple directions to go with that, and maybe we could start with someone's own name and how important that plays a role into identity, because actually let's start there and then I have a couple follow-up questions to go from there. But
my focus on names has mostly been just why they're the most difficult words to learn, period. And if you have some sort of brain damage, that's like the first thing to go. Part of that is that they're unique to us, right? You meet one person named Joe, it's not going to help you identify another person named Joe. Whereas if you learn the word tiger, that's going to help you identify other tigers. And so there's that aspect of it. And then, they're just used in different ways. I've kind of always felt a little privileged because I have a name that's unusual in most countries. But at the same time, if you see it written, it's relatively easy to figure out how it's pronounced, and it's easy to speak or say, at least in English. So, people put such a weight on knowing their names. I mean, often you're very offended if somebody calls you by the wrong name. So people kind of go out of their way sometimes to avoid using a name if they're not 100% sure.
Yeah, it's actually I had forgotten Anthony as the name of the guy who works here, and I forgot it when I was referring at the beginning. And I was like, oh, me and him were just talking, so I just was a culprit of it. But there's some really interesting things as well that you were studying on recalling certain names and how parents sometimes have difficulty with it. And one question, kind of as we segue into that, I was curious about is I come from a family of three, and my mom often mistakes, my name's Robert, my brother's name is Matt and Katie. She'll say Matt, Katie, sometimes her siblings' names before she'll say one of our names. And so
Are they older?
My brother's older, my sister is younger, and then she'll say some of her other siblings to try and recall it. And I'm curious if context-based clues help us recall names. And so I'm curious if there's certain situations that help us recall a name. So in this specific dynamic, if a parent is disciplining one child, are they more likely to recall the name of the child they're most used to disciplining?
Yeah, anecdotally, that definitely seems to be the case. I have not found a good way to really capture that, like scientifically. Right? You always want to have like something we can quantify. So the work I did was mostly looking at. So you're like 3 times more likely to be called by a sibling's name if they're the same gender. If they're close in age, that also makes a difference. If you're a younger sibling, you're more likely to be called by an older sibling's name than vice versa. And then the thing I was really interested in was just the features of a name, so like how they sound. So it turns out if your name starts with the same sound or ends with the same sound as a sibling's name, that also increases the likelihood that your parents will call you by the wrong name, which is kind of fun because, of course, a lot of parents go out of their way to give their kids names that start with the same sound. And while that can kind of help bring a feeling of like, okay, we're in this family together. Because often we share last names, although not always these days with their family. But having that extra, we're all starting with J, can maybe bring that extra feeling of solidarity. But at the same time, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot where it's like you might end up just mixing up their names frequently.
Does that play a role? So that, let's say the younger child is constantly being called the other person's name. Does that play a role at all in that child's like confidence or that child's identity within the world?
It might. I don't have any data to speak to that, but I know like my little sister, I mean, the thing is often younger siblings have all kinds of issues with older siblings anyways, right? Where, the older is like paved the path and it's like you are constantly getting compared to them. So it would be hard to kind of separate out that from just being called by
similar name.
A similar name.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I know. So my mother often uses my name when she's talking about my sister, and then like talking to my sister. And my sister definitely doesn't appreciate it. She's younger. Yeah.
But it's so interesting because it's like you don't even realize it as you're doing this, and it's also kind of nice to understand that this is pretty standard across the world. This is just a human, I guess, symptom. So because often people make you, well. People get offended if you forget their name, but it seems like this is just a symptom of humanity.
Yeah, and also part of it is with speech errors, so calling somebody with the wrong name. Mostly when people think of speech errors, they think of like Freudian slips, like, oh, did you call me by that name because you prefer that person or dislike me. And actually, the reason I started doing that work was I published a paper on other types of speech errors, and I actually, for the first time, got emails from just people in the public asking about mixing up people's names.
Yeah.
And it was like one was a father who mixed up his daughter's names, like Katie and Chloe, which start with the same sound, end with the same sound, natural. And then there were a few where it was like calling a current partner by a previous partner's name, which you can imagine is really like, that's touchy, right? And like that really lends itself to this kind of Freudian interpretation where it's like, or like, you still love her, that's why you called me by her name. And so one of the things I'd like about the work is like, well, there are these other principles about how the brain works, how language works that make that kind of error much more likely. And so, again, like if your names just happen to start with the same sound, that's going to make that a mistake more likely, and you don't have to put a Freudian kind of spin
interpretation.
On it.
Yeah, and then when it comes to relationships, is that based off of, because again, it's like we'll recall names in because of context clues, so it could just be, oh, this is something that I did with my previous partner.
Yeah, and actually, especially one of the examples I got was the person said, "I love you," and then the X's name.
Yeah.
And you can imagine you've had all this practice where, for many years, when you were with this other person, where it's like, when you start saying I love you, it ends with that name. And so now, you're with this new person and you've trained your brain to say that other thing once you start I love you. And so it's kind of a natural mistake to make.
Yeah, rather than the actual Freudian of I
Yeah.
still love you. It's good to know, and it makes sense because, whenever going back into how someone builds their identity it's just like neurons that are consistently, I guess, like working within the same narrative that we have in our head.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we just change the way that we do something in this example of who we love at the end of this sentence, then we start to rewire this. I guess, like, is that this subconscious brain that kind of comes into play?
Yeah. And actually, one way to think about it is like paths. So you wear down one path over and over again, and now you're trying to go a different path, but it's so much easier to follow the old path.
Yeah, there's not any like brush or anything that you have to cut out of the way, and so you're just walking on the well-trodden path. And then another thing that I thought was interesting is my buddy and I were talking about this yesterday, in how much changing a name can impact an identity. And so we talked about, like, in our own experiences. So I used to go by Robert for 18 years of my life, and then when I went to college, I switched my name to Rob, and it was like a ceremonious change. Like, oh, here's this Robert 2.0, and then for him it was Alex to Xander, and he was doing it in similar, or in relation, I guess, to the uniqueness, similar to how your name is unique, Zenzi. No one's going to forget the name Xander. It's spelled with an X. So he's like, in their head, they're really memorable. And so I'm curious, kind of, what is like the science behind that shift of is it so much in how other people see us, or how it is that we now have this belief internally of who we are?
Yeah, I think the part of what drives those kinds of name changes is this idea that I want to change my identity, or kind of start over, and maybe in some way, and it seems like that happens a lot, at major points in somebody's life, right? So it's like, I'm going to college now. I want to, I'm done being,
this ruffian or something.
Yeah. And then, of course, the classic example is like when people transition to another gender, right? That's a big thing, is like, choosing a new name, and hopefully getting other people to use it consistently. And again, the same kind of issue, unfortunately, comes up, where dead naming is, horrible, and actually one of the predictors of like suicide risk among people who are identify as transgender. But if you're interacting with the same people as before, they're used to this path of calling you this other name. And while yes, some people might dead name on purpose because they're transphobic or something, other people are just struggling because it's like all these cues, everything point to this old name.
That's what dead naming is? I haven't heard that phrase before.
Yeah. Basically, it's calling somebody by their old name.
Yeah. Okay. And then that brings up frustration or anything from.
Yeah. Because one of the big things is having people respect your identity, and by using an old name, that suggests that they're not acknowledging the change, especially that you have this new identity, and this new that you have. That you're now living in this identity, this gender that you previously weren't.
Yeah, and in addition to, so focusing on kind of life transitions, in addition to a name change, what else helps kind of build the new narrative? Kind of how else is it that we speak, or like the shift in language that we have within ourselves, or maybe with others, it helps with those transitions in life?
That's a good question. I can only speculate. But of course, what other things that go with like gender shift are getting more voice, getting one's voice to match the gender more, right? So often people go through like training to either like get like a higher pitch,
or deeper voice.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Wow. And yet it's super interesting. To be honest, I'm not very familiar with much of the transgender type of shift in someone's life, and so I don't know anyone personally who has done it, and so that's actually a fascinating thing. And the life transitions that I was thinking about discussing were like, if I'm going to quit a job or something, or if I'm getting married or whatnot. But we could stay on the transgender subject of, I guess, when someone is ready for a change in their life, how does that start to formulate, I guess, within their head? Is that like, hey, I don't identify with this anymore, so I want to move into this new person, or how does that?
Oh, yeah, I really can't speak to that. It's way outside my expertise. But it's interesting. You also mentioned marriage, right? So traditionally, women would take their husband's last name, and again, that's kind of a new identity. Also, traditionally, kind of a shift in ownership, right? It used to be your father's property, and now your husband's property. But
how does that work? I wrote that down actually as a question as well. Is like, is there a psychological shift when it goes to the adoption of a last name?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, and that's part of the reason why I think now, number one, a lot of women do not change their names, their last names, because it's like, no, I'm my own individual. I'm not going to, there's no reason I should take on this name when my partner is not taking on my name. And then, there's some couples where they just sit down and they're like, we're going to take a new name. Let's talk about what new name we're both going to take. And then, especially with children, when you have parents with different last names, you can have kind of a negotiation about, well, which name they're going to take. And I know I have a friend who, and actually I think it was even before they had kids, they were planning to have kids, was like, the deal was that the kids could have her husband's last name, but she would get to choose their first names.
It's a cool compromise.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so I'm actually bilingual. I speak Spanish, and so I have a deep connection with Latin America, and a lot of the Latin American cultures, which I'm sure living in Austin, everyone might have like Jose Maria Gonzalez de la Puerta or something, and it's both the mom and the dad last name.
Yeah.
But no, it's super interesting, and so a shift that can occur there. Because I'm curious is like, let's say if a woman were to accept the last name of their husband, would they start to emulate like the idea of what she sees their husband's family to be, or is that unrelated?
I couldn't speak to that. I have no idea.
No worries. I think it's a very fascinating thing, and just the name that you choose can really help build your identity. And then I'm curious, like, how much does the uniqueness of a name determine someone's success?
Ooh. It's hard to say because, definitely, we have these examples of artists who are so successful, they're able to go by one name.
Kendrick.
Yeah, and like Madonna, Beyonce. Did that contribute? Because they did have these kind of unique singular names to, being more recognizable, or, how much were they going, they're so talented that, it really didn't make any difference. But definitely it's kind of a hallmark, right, of being a big success where you're like, no, you don't even need a last name. That one's me. Yeah.
It's so the name of my show. I don't know if it's the same email that I reach out to you, but it's the Don Rob Show, where that was a name that was given to me when I was in Guatemala for a summer, because Don just means sir, so everyone called me Don Roberto, and I was like, okay, there's Robert, there's Rob, and then there's this ideal version that I'm always aspiring to meet, which is the Don Rob. And so I was like, okay, this is a shift into it, and it's like I can't just be Rob here, but even in my own life and my own experience, I'm like, okay, hey, this is who I'm going to be.
Yeah. Really then, a lot of it is like how you, so what name you call somebody by does reflect a lot about your attitude towards them, and often like status, right? So as a professor, we want our undergrads to, call us, Professor Griffin, Dr. Griffin, and also, oh, and actually in Sweden, there's a level of, so I lived in Sweden for 6 years, so there's a level of informality. And so you really are supposed to, like, even your professors, it's just natural you call them by their first names. Whereas here you don't. And one of the issues is when students don't, they're more likely to call a female professor by their first name, which probably does reflect just this, general, less respect for women, or this idea that they're, generally more approachable, and, likewise, they rarely call a male professor something like,
Bill.
Mr. Markman or something like
yeah.
that, right? But, female professors often get called Ms. whatever or Mrs. whatever, kind of overlooking that they have these degrees and this status. So yeah, that's another part with identity that's important. And then there's kind of classic stuff, right, where your parents, when they're angry with you, might call you by your full name, right?
Robert Joseph Weigel. Shit,
Yes.
what'd I do, Mom?
Exactly.
That's so interesting. And it's you mentioned something that was fascinating as well, which is like how you identify as a marker of status. And I'm just thinking there are certain places in status that you kind of want to like showcase where, if you're starting off, you're saying that you want to be referred to as the title that you earned. So doctor or professor or something like this. And then it's interesting, like as you climb maybe the status ladder, you remove those markers and you don't need to show as much. And so one of the first things, with us, you were saying, hey, don't call me Dr. Griffin, call me Zenzi. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. And really, ideally, I'd be fine with everybody calling me Zenzi, but because like with undergraduates, it can be misinterpreted as like I don't have like a lack of status and professionalism. So really, like for me, almost like as soon as like a student starts working in my lab, so we're working closely, I'm like, you can call me Zenzi.
Yeah.
And a lot of them aren't comfortable with that. And I'm like, okay, you don't have to be, if you're not comfortable, don't do it. Call me what you're comfortable with.
Griffin.
And it's interesting because some students will kind of split the difference. So they'll call me Dr. Zenzi.
Oh, that's cool. That's a nice happy medium, Dr. Zenzi.
Yeah.
I like that. And then some more of the work that you were doing was in language formulation and how our eye movement plays a role in that. Could you share a little bit more about this?
Yeah. So it's difficult to figure out how far in advance are people planning what they're going to say, and so I did my early work was one of the first studies using people's eye movements when they were describing a picture to try to get insight into how they were planning, and we had no idea what we'd find, if we'd find anything, and in studying speaking, what we often do is show people pictures and ask them to describe them, because that's one way of kind of putting an idea, a message into somebody's head for them so you can kind of control what they're going to say without actually telling them what they're going to say, in which case, if they're just repeating, they're not generating it themselves. And so if you show somebody a picture of something like a woman throwing a bone to a dog, a really simple scene, it turns out like we're really fast at recognizing what's going on in a scene. So people can figure out like, okay, what's happening in that scene before moving their eyes within, like a couple tenths of a second. But they still then, and this holds for a lot of things, we tend to focus on things that we're thinking about, that we're trying to maybe make a decision about. And so what you see is people honing in on whatever thing they're going to mention first, so usually like the woman in that scenario, and it takes about a second to come up with a name for something. And that depends on things like how common the word is that you're trying to come up with, if there's multiple choices, or you're like, do I want to use this name or this name for that thing? And so you're making that decision about the first thing you're going to mention. And And in theory, you could plan the whole sentence and then rattle it off. But what we find is that people prefer to kind of do things on the fly. So as you're, you plan, say the word woman, as you're actually saying the word woman, it's only then that you're planning whatever is the next noun. So if you're going to say a woman is throwing a bone to a dog, then as you're saying woman, you'll be looking at the bone, and the amount of time you spend looking at the bone reflects how difficult it is to come up with that word. And then as you're saying bone, you're looking at the dog and coming up with that word. And so that was a kind of a fun way to see what was happening as people speak, see how on the fly it is.
Knowing this, can this help folks? Is there anything with bring that awareness to that can help folks speak more clearly?
Speak more clearly. I don't know about that. I mean, it comes in useful for things like figuring out, or predicting what people are going to talk about. It turns out that, or what they are talking about. So like little children pay attention to what their parents are looking at and figuring out, is maybe this new word actually referring to this object or this object? Because by seeing, where is my parent looking when they label it, can tell you what they're talking about. And actually, they're really good at avoiding, even if they're like playing with a toy that they don't know the name of and they hear a new word, unless they note that the parent is attending to that, they won't associate the new word with that toy. They really want to make sure that the parent is attending to that. And then it's been interesting because I see, I have Google alerts from when my work is cited, and it's come up in so many different places. So even for training pilots, apparently you by having their eye movements monitored while somebody is training them, so they're in the cockpit, somebody is monitoring what they're doing and giving them feedback by knowing what they're looking at and what they're talking about, provides extra insight in helping the person who's training them figure out what's going on.
That's incredible. There's a couple of things that this makes me think about. One of them is going back to the life transition thing and how advice typically that comes in from folks who are giving advice to someone who needs to go through a transition is like, hey, get objective with where you're at, because you're too in the moment. And then like a meditation that I know is really popular is laying down on your bed and then imagining yourself like a character in a movie, and then slowly the camera pans out to it's just you in your bed, then it's the house, then it's the block, then it's your city, then it's the state, country, and the world, and then you realize the problems aren't that bad.
Right.
So I think that's so interesting. And is there a connection there between the two of just what you pay attention to ends up informing, I guess, your surroundings and your sense of well-being?
Yeah, I mean, perspective is everything, right?
Yeah.
And definitely getting out of our own heads to the extent we can is important. One of my colleagues has done some Jamie Pennebaker has done some really interesting work about the effects of having people write about their experiences and write about themselves. And there's great, mental health benefits to doing that. And part of that is kind of externalizing things, getting you to reflect on things. And that even, health-wise, mental health-wise, but I think also he's done some work on relationships. So writing about a relationship can help strengthen it.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite people ever. I've done his journal exercise twice.
Oh, okay.
On two different moments, and I've talked about it so many times on the show, and it has changed my life significantly. It is to a point where I saw weight loss visually, and then mentally there's a clear. So no, it's so cool. And then for those who are just listening, is essentially it's just expressive writing can really help you go through traumatic moments, essentially, right? Just really intentional. And then another thing that it was reminding me of what you were saying is that we can predict what people are thinking about by paying attention to what it is that they say. So I've seen videos of people who do like a form of hypnosis, and the way in that they do that is that later in this clip, they ask them to say, okay, hey, I'm going to guess what animal that you're thinking of. You're going to draw on a piece of paper. I'm going to guess what animal you're thinking of. And then they say elephant. And then they're like, holy shit, it was an elephant. But then leading up before that, they then reveal that multiple times throughout the interaction with that person, they mentioned an elephant, or they mentioned something big, or they mentioned something gray.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of like we don't know, we don't have great insight into why we do the things we do, and so you can basically plant the seeds of things that make, say the word elephant more available, or the idea of an elephant more available, and so somebody will choose that and will think, oh well, I'm
free will.
it's free will, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, where it's like
Not so much.
Not so much.
Holy cow. So knowing that, is there a way for us to become more aware of the decisions that we're making?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is reflecting sometimes and not going immediately with like your gut instinct. Daniel Kahneman and others have talked about like System 1 and System 2, or system, which I think is an awful way of referring to things because it's so arbitrary, but this idea that you have fast, intuitive thinking, and then you have the slower, more deliberative, and things like and the fast stuff is, we can't think through every single decision we make because we'd be kind of stuck in, not doing anything if that was the case. And so it is efficient to have like these kind of gut reactions, but at the same time, I mean, that leads to often things like discrimination and prejudice, because a lot of that is really available. Even if you're completely anti-racist, you're growing up in a racist society, and so a lot of those tropes are there in your head, and so so people talk about implicit bias. So this unconscious bias, and one way of overcoming that is stepping back and being like, okay, what are the factors? Like maybe if I have to evaluate somebody for a job, okay, what are the instead of being like, I just don't feel good about the person, or maybe they don't feel professional, stepping back and being like, okay, what are the features that I'm looking for in this, like say hiring decision, and comparing people, this feature, this feature, this feature, this feature. So basically making it more deliberative, and often kind of leveling the playing field.
Super interesting. And as you were saying that, I'm trying to think of like how to be informed on when to take a System 1 versus System 2 reaction. And System 1 is gut, essentially, and System 2 is more deliberate thinking.
Exactly.
And from how I've been able to navigate life, sometimes well, sometimes not, but from the moments of like reflecting on it, is much of it can be emotion based, not necessarily acting in emotions, because that typically doesn't work out well for anyone. But like when you were saying that there might be a prejudice that exists. So if I'm thinking of if I see someone, or if someone sees someone, then if there's like an emotion that is negative about them, then okay, then that's reacting essentially on that negative emotion would be a failure of decision making. So you wouldn't want to go towards the immediate gut instinct of System 2, whereas then you could open it up and say, okay, where does this fear lie? Like what is the reason behind that? Why do I have this emotional trigger in any case? But no, that's, go ahead.
Well, and I mean, definitely when you have like a big decision to make, thinking it through. And that's not to say that your gut reaction is always wrong, but examining it and thinking it through. Because again, part of sometimes people have talked about like why you should go with your gut feeling and why you should trust it, but because you might be picking up on cues that are just not accessible to your conscious mind. But especially for kind of big decisions and making judgments, especially ones that affect people, and like their lives. Yeah, thinking it through is really important.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to dissect in terms of where to do it, because another example came into mind in which a gut decision does make sense, which was in Malcolm Gladwell's book. I think it was Outliers, or I think it would have been Blink, but essentially it starts off with the story of there's a museum that bought a statue from an anonymous buyer that came out of nowhere, and the statue was from a certain part of time in like the Roman era. And it was like, okay, well, there's no statues that exist like this. And then boom, out of the blue, this seller comes up and then goes to this museum and says, hey, I can sell this to you for like $2 million or whatever. They're going crazy because holy cow, we finally found a statue that is so pristine and perfect in this condition. Let's just double check with our like chemical analysis and then the marble analysis and everything to see if it checks out. Checks out everything there. But then they bring in these experts who have been in the field of like understanding like marble carving for 15 years or something like that, and someone who just understands like that specific area, and they've been in it for 17 years, but all these different experts that are in it, and then every single one of them arrives to the museum, steps in, and then immediately they just say that's fake. They have no other reason why, and the more they looked into it, the more they started to convince themselves that it wasn't real. But the museum ended up buying it, $2 million or something. The anonymous buyer disappears. And then lo and behold, 6 months later, they realize that it is indeed a fake. And so it's just insane that there's this superpower that exists within us, which is this gut. And then there's just the okay, when do we work on deciding is the feeling that comes up is red or blue, negative or positive.
Right.
Super interesting. Yeah, and then okay, so back to the way that we come up with sentences with our eyes. Said another thing that I thought was fascinating is that essentially communication is what, like 60% with our eyes or something, or 60% body language, and then
I've heard that. Yeah, body language is
massive, and then of the body language, it's something that's like 50% of that 60% is with our eyes. It's so interesting, and so I'm curious. There's another gentleman who I wanted to run by to see if you know who he is. I think his name is Dr. Weber. I don't think if I wrote it down, but essentially, I'm curious what happens when we lose a sense, and then what happens to the rest of our senses. So this guy is a blind food reviewer, among other things. But if you watch his videos, he'll eat like fruit and he'll describe it in the most incredible way, and he like, doesn't waste a single word. And so I'm just curious, have you ever observed language formulation in blind people, or do you know any science on that?
I have not. The only work I know associated with that, so going back to vision, so I believe there's a little bit of a lag in language development in kids who are blind, because again, they don't have that cue of where somebody's looking to help them figure out, what's going on and what to associate with different objects. And then it turns out, like, and actually one of my favorite things to lecture about in terms of language processing is gesture. Basically, which a form of body language. And it turns out that even people who are congenitally blind, so they have never seen anything, any gestures, and they're talking to somebody who, also is congenitally blind, has never seen it, they'll still gesture. And this idea that you usually think about that as maybe being for the listeners or the addressees' benefit, but it also plays a role in helping the speaker kind of formulate their thoughts and put them together when speaking. And I always found that really fascinating, that, even blind people who've never seen people gesture.
Do they really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. And they still communicate like that. No, I remember one of the things that I learned about, which was if you want to be a better communicator, is essentially to start talking with your hands more, because I guess it does make it so it's easier for you to be able to speak.
So it does help the listener. There's studies that suggest that teachers who gesture more, the students learn more.
I wonder if that's like because they're more engaging and kids have something to look at.
Right. Yeah, but then also it's another form, because it mirrors what you're talking about. So anytime you have information in more than one modality, so you have the auditory, what the person's saying, but now you also have something visual. When you have that combination, that's going to be better than having anything in just one modality.
Have you ever studied anything with your work that has made you really reflect on your life and just go like, holy shit, that was crazy, and then change the way that you communicate?
Well, one insight I had, because I have this fascination about, how we're able to speak in real time, and why we're disfluent sometimes, and speech rate varies. And then I had this insight that, well, that wasn't just coming from nowhere. It's like, no, there's times when my speech rate varies widely, and when the words are just coming so slowly. And so I was like, oh, okay, because there's this term me-search, or instead of research, where people basically choose to study something that's very related to their own identities. And then I realized, I never thought I was doing that. And then I realized, well, no, I'm studying something that is something that happens, these differences in planning and speech rate in my own life.
Yeah. No, it's super, super fascinating. Now that's making me think of like, why is it that Southern cultures talk a hell of a lot slower, but you go up north to New York and people are speaking at, this crazy rate. Is there any science behind that?
Yeah, so we tend to match.
Yeah.
So in all kinds of different features, when we're talking to somebody, we move a little bit closer. I mean, we might not speak exactly like they do, but we move a little bit closer to speaking like they do. So, a really simple one is volume, but also speech rate, using the same words, and even using the same sentence structures, and it makes sense that, when you have a group, they're kind of, people who are interacting with each other regularly, they're going to end up speaking more similarly. And you get that with just dialects, accents, and so on. And it's funny, I did one study at Stanford, and then I basically ran it again when I moved to Georgia Tech. And I was looking at the results, for exactly the same thing, and I found that the Stanford students started speaking. Well, no, they spoke more quickly, so their speech rate was faster than the Georgia Tech students, but they let's see, and they let's see. And this is when they were perfectly fluent. But they took a little bit longer to start, which is, the reason they could speak so quickly was that they waited a little bit. Whereas the Georgia Tech students, they could start speaking earlier, but that was in part because they were speaking more slowly. And so they had more time to kind of plan what they're going to say as they were speaking.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
So given that buffer allows for the rate of communication to go faster, and then when you do talk slower, it's essentially like, okay, hey, I'm building it. Even I can build the sentence like as I'm going.
Yeah,
and that's so interesting. And so if someone wanted to change the way that they spoke, the rate of speech, could they just add that little pause beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, and just slow down. The slower you speak, the more likely you are to be fluent, because part of the reason we have disfluencies is that we're basically something is not ready when we need it. So the word I want to say next, I'm still retrieving it. And so it's not there when I finish what I said before. And so slowing down helps a lot. And then there's more boring things like repetition. If you're saying the same thing over and over again, then it's going to, you're practiced. It's going to come out more smoothly. But, who wants to keep repeating themselves if they can help it?
Rappers.
Oh.
I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, I'm like, holy cow, like, what are the different applications that this could go through? And I just imagine that if I'm a rapper, or I'm someone who just wants, like, a speed rapper. I don't know if you've ever seen some of these people who can just like come up with freestyle rapping.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Oh my God.
How does that work?
I don't know. And actually, I've thought about, is there a way I can kind of study study this, kind of quantify it. And I suspect a lot of it is that they have like go-to rhymes. They know, they have like a list of things that they know rhyme, and then like maybe some set phrases that they can, because they're so well rehearsed, they can say that and then be thinking about what's coming after that. But yeah,
it's so fascinating. Yeah, because it's also interesting to understand. It would be interesting to understand if anyone could do it, essentially, if you could train yourself to do it, because it is a gift for many folks just to be able to just boom a really cool beat on, because then it's, I guess, two things: one, rapid sentence formulation, and then also melody, like being able to actually be on beat too. I feel like those are two different skills to build.
And actually there is research suggesting that putting things, having a rhythm can help, and especially like retrieving, if you want to study like a language, actually learning some of the songs can help you get, kind of get those phrases, get those words, kind of to stick in your head. So yeah, there's research showing that. And yeah, rhythm is a nice way of kind of organizing what you're going to say.
I was about to say that because in my Spanish class, I think it was maybe junior year in high school, our teacher had us memorize all the capitals of Central and South America. And it was through a song. And so every time that I think of a capital,
it sticks with you, right?
Yeah, Lima, Peru, Lima, Peru. It's so interesting. And so the same, I imagine, could apply to like name recalling as well, as like if you because I've seen people who have a really cool skill where this one girl I worked with, she was able to memorize like 150 people's name within a week of orientation.
Wow.
And she did it consistently. And she would always just like have, I think, maybe a rhythm or song within their head. So if anyone is listening, essentially they can build a song or something.
And actually, kind of going back to names, like just learning people's names is so hard. And like some of the tricks are, as soon as they say their name, like repeat it back. And then, it can be awkward because I think and there's also this thing where people use your name, you tend to like them a little bit better. And so you have like some salespeople, I think, or it might even be in like Dale Carnegie's book where, the way to get people to like you is use their name. And, if it becomes noticeable, then it's just obnoxious, right?
Yeah. That's enough.
But, just repeating it back helps. And then if you can find associations,
Double Z Zenzi.
Yeah,
Something
exactly.
Like that.
And then mine is also helpful because there's so few Z's. So if people have trouble remembering my name, they're like, oh well, I know they'll think of a Z, and actually I'll answer to Z. Some of my friends will call me Z, so that's fine. But you also might be like, Zenzi is Zen or something, right? Just coming up with a rhyme will help, but then also like maybe if somebody's last name is like Gardner, picture them in a garden or something like that. Yeah,
that's so interesting. So to be able to memorize as many possible, just collect as many associations that you can have.
Yeah, actually, I used to have an exercise. I don't know why I stopped doing this, but like some years, I always have students introduce themselves at the beginning of class, and I used to have one where I'd be like, is there a story behind your name? That your parents told you, and again, that was like that. Just getting that extra time thinking about somebody's name and associating with them while they're telling you that also helps. And so I just I admittedly I can't remember what the student looked like, but I remember there was one who was like, well, my name is Colin, but and my parents like wanted to spell it, this unusual way because they're afraid people pronounce it as colon. It's like,
I guess that's
really?
a good precaution. That's hilarious.
Yeah. And so that stuck, that was like 20 years ago.
That's so interesting. Yeah. And I guess like, what does your name mean to you? It's super interesting. And then the more time you spend on it. And then you referenced this in the beginning, which I thought was such a cool thing that you did as well, which was bilingual work. And I'm curious, like how much of the language that we speak, helps build our identity. So
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, language and culture are intertwined. I mean, you really can't, it's very hard to learn a language without also learning something about the culture. And the more you kind of identify with that culture, of course, that kind of reinforces you wanting to learn that language. And like one hypothesis of, there's many reasons why it's more difficult to learn a language as you get older, but one possible contributor to that is that you're less willing to kind of change your identity or like incorporate something new into your identity, like you might need to, or in order to express yourself and learn this new language. And I definitely, and I think, just even having a bilingual, like, there is like almost a bilingual identity in and of itself, right? The people, are being multilingual. Is a source of pride, and like when you meet other people, if you feel like even if you only have one language in common, it's like okay, you kind of get each other at a different level, and then on top of that, if you do speak like two languages in common, being able to speak like Spanglish or Swinglish, Swedish English. Kind of brings people together in a way, and is just like a lot of fun because you can start doing this like cross-linguistic wordplay, and that also so that kind of also is a way of kind of bringing people together, and making them kind of I guess identify with each other as a group.
Totally. And what I've found with Spanglish is that there are some words that I will use specifically in Spanish when talking in English, and then an English word when talking in Spanish, because like just a word has so much more meaning in whatever language that it's there. There's so much more behind it. And I'm curious if you found the same with Swinglish.
Yeah.
And is there like, how does, because I've talked with this with other folks, and they say the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, this word just is way better spoken in Spanish when we're talking in English, and vice versa.
Yeah, and a lot of we have kind of words have kind of standard conventional meanings that are shared, but they also we have like idiosyncratic experiences with different words, and so it might be that just personally you've kind of have a richer insight in those words. There's also some interesting work about emotions and language, where kind of the later you learn a language, the kind of blunter your kind of emotional reaction to words in that. I mean, the classic kind of example is that like taboo words in your like native language, even if you curse up a storm, normally you still have like a little reaction when you hear them. But then, and you might be used to kind of censoring yourself when you're speaking. But in your second language, often it's just like, whatever. They just don't resonate in the same way.
No, they don't at all. When you say swear words in Spanish, like it's kind of way more comical than it would be as anything that could border on offensive. That's so interesting. And then another thing that I've noticed within myself is like love as a thing. I express it better in Spanish, and I've had partners that are Spanish speaking, and like the depths of the love for those relationships is so much more profound than I've been able to have with people in my own native language, which I've found is strange. I don't know if there's what does that say?
Yeah, that's interesting. And especially, I mean, maybe it was like a lot of your early kind of foundational relationships maybe were with Spanish speakers. No,
I mean,
okay.
I took Spanish immersion. I started when I was in first grade. And it was, I don't know, I was, as you were saying that, I was thinking about it, and like my experience with Spanish is I've always had the same group of friends. So like the Spanish immersion class that existed in Texas or in San Antonio was one group of people that stayed together from first grade until 12th grade, which is not common. Yeah, it was so cool. So like everyone who's in there, even if we're not close anymore and I haven't talked to them for years, I feel like there's just this profound connection that I have with all of them. And then, I didn't have a relationship with someone who was where the predominant language was Spanish speaking until maybe like 2 years ago, and I'm 30.
Oh.
So I don't know. Maybe it was like a reconnection with this like really unique
Yeah.
thing.
Or maybe it's just that you've matured to the level that you can really,
It's also
yeah.
a possibility. Yeah.
But yeah, and actually, I mean, so my mother's Swedish, and so I started off speaking Swedish, but then because we were living in California, and she didn't think it would be a useful language for me because not many people speak it, she stopped. So I completely forgot it. She thought I'd never need it. And then we moved to Sweden when I was 14 and I had to relearn it, which is part of where my interest, I think, in language came from, and especially bilingualism. But, you know, I was 14, and again, like I resisted. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And I really managed not to learn a whole lot for a few years. I even managed to, you know, Swedish was mandatory, but I managed to get people in high school them thinking that I was, you know, they were confused about which class I was in, so I wasn't going to any of the classes
nice.
for like a semester. But when what ended up getting me to really buckle down and want to learn was my grandmother didn't have great English, and so I wanted to be close to her, so improving my Swedish. But then, of course, I got a Swedish boyfriend.
Hey, there you go.
And there I was like, oh, yep, there we go.
Yeah. So I feel like that's also a fantastic way of learning is for what I've always referred to, it is like a long hair dictionary for a man and a girlfriend, but same thing, just a dictionary of the other gender. But no, it's super helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, that really and it's, you know, a huge motivator, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And then the connection as well with the grandma is really profound, because it's cool that it can inform wanting to learn a language. And then it's also pretty cool that you resisted learning another language and now you're a language professor.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really cool. And then, so by knowing two different languages, bilingual folks or people who are multilingual, does that give folks a cognitive advantage in terms of having like a deeper amount of emotional empathy?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I do think it broadens, again, your perspective. And, you know, in multiple ways, right? And I do think that has effects on how you view different people, and you know, kind of realizing that your culture isn't the end all be all, right? Which you know. You know, the U.S. is very unusual in how relatively monolingual it is. I mean, it's getting more and more bilingual, and I think we're approaching, like, you know, we're probably at least at 40% or something. But at the same time, there's this whole pressure about, like, you know, give up your home language, learn English to be a success, and this kind of misconception that that there's a zero-sum game, so that, you know, improving one language is going to be at the expense of the other, which is completely false. You know, as you know from being raised in or having bilingual education. So definitely. It's you know, and how much of it is language and how much of it is just learning about another culture, which goes with it, how much that might drive empathy and perspective. But
because they are really impossible to separate from.
Yeah.
You really can't. Yeah, because you can't separate language from culture essentially at all. Really, like it's kind of one and the same. Because so much of identity building comes from the language that you express and then what you say to yourself. And then one thing that I was thinking on earlier that you were saying of kind of the camaraderie that it builds is that when you go into a new culture, like some of the first markers of acceptance that I had when I was going into when I was living in Mexico, for example, was when I did start to pick up the really, really subtle nuances in slang. And I'd say it and they were like, oh, they'd cheer. And then there was like a welcoming in. And so it was like, okay, this is like specifically like Northern culture in Mexico that I can understand with. And then this is this. So yeah, no, it's really, really interesting.
And slang is a great example of, like, you know, that, you know, we talk, you know, social psychology, you talk about in groups, your group, and then everybody else is the out group, right? And how, you know, how you really put people in the in group. You prioritize them. You sympathize with them more. Even down to things like. If somebody does something wrong, if you're in group, you look for like, well, it was probably because of this, or, motivate. Whereas if it's somebody in the out group, it's like, well, they're a bad person.
It's crazy.
But one way of marking that is slang, and and especially youth culture, right? Coming up with new slang, and what happens when it starts getting broad, which it does, right? If your mother starts using a slang term, well, it's over.
Yeah,
It's
mom
like,
starts saying it's lit.
it's uncool. Exactly.
It's so interesting, yeah, because in like how slang starts to evolve, and then kind of how then you start to no longer be in that in group. I've noticed it now just having been one of the defining folks of slang in my generation, and now getting out of it, I'm looking at these kids. I'm like, what the fuck are you guys saying?
Right.
Like,
And that's part of the whole point, right?
Yeah,
It's like, you just don't get it, that it's for us. It's not for you. Actually, I got an email recently from somebody who was writing an article for like, I don't know, senior citizen kind of thing about like how to learn, the kids' slang and use it. And I'm like, don't use it. Like, you will look ridiculous. It would be, it's not for you.
Yeah,
it's not for you. And I've noticed it myself. So I'm a huge fan of RuPaul's Drag Race in all its forms, like every franchise. And so I know a lot of that slang, and actually a lot of it's creeping into what also the kind of youth do. And I'm like, I am not using it. That is not for me. And I know I would look ridiculous if I started talking about, she's giving, and, I slay. And
That's awesome. But I feel like it would still be so welcomed if you just drop it every once in a while. And I'm sure in your classes, if you were to drop, hey guys, slay the weekend or something. Yo.
They would be, actually, that's a good point. If I want to make a joke, that would be, they'd probably find that really hilarious.
That's so interesting. Slang is such a fascinating world, and in how you explained essentially the in and out group, and how it's like, hey, this is specifically for us, and you're not supposed to get it. And the same thing I was reflecting on when I was looking through like fashion that exists now, which is also pretty much impossible to separate with the slang and the language, because they both inform each other. And yeah, the same thing as like this fashion that was coming up. I was like, well, like I was confused. That confused is probably just like the main thing, but I was confused. I was like, this is so strange, because this was considered dorky when I was here, right. And then now it's like, what are you guys doing? And so again, like now, like thinking on it with what you're saying is that it's not for me. Essentially, is like it exists, it's cool, and it's not for me. But it also makes me think about the dangers of, I guess, latching onto one identity for so long, because there's like life is just a constant reinvention. And so like, okay, hey, like this is fashion changes, like language changes. And so I think of the thing that I want to avoid being, which is like the grumpy old man who just says like,
get off my lawn.
Yeah, back in my day.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm almost 55 now, and it's like just you notice it creeping up, and it's like, kids these days.
Yeah, you say it in your head, and you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
So
or this generation, and intellectually, like, people are complaining about your generation, and everybody has always been like that generation. And also like with language, right? They're ruining the language with their slang, and they don't know how to talk anymore, and or texting and emojis, and it's just like every single generation has been like those new ones are ruining the language. I mean, actually, because I lived in right near the San Fernando Valley when I was growing up, and so there was Valley Speak, like Moon Unit, Zappa, and they were like, those kids are never going to be able to get jobs. Because we said that, gag me with the spoon, I'm so sure. And it's like, no, it turns out
they did pretty well.
you can get a job.
It's super interesting though, how even coming out of like, as we all grow into that stage, the cultural repetition is the same use of these phrases, which is, it's like there's an invention of something new, and then as we grow older, it's like the repeated behavior, which is, okay, hey, we've seen the people before us do this. And then the script that it continuously exists within us is what you're just saying is, kids these days, you're ruining X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. And it's so fascinating to understand that on like a meta cultural level, so by nation. And then also you can even narrow that down into like the family unit as well. Is I think a common thing people say is like, oh, like you look at his dad, that's who he's going to turn into, or look at her mom, that's going to be who they're turned into, and like there's just these markers that almost seem inevitable. Is there? Do you do any research essentially on like genetic markers that just like pull into that, or like social cultural markers?
No, I'm very. Yeah, if I can't stick it in the lab and doing an experiment, I usually don't. I'm beginning to branch out, and like the study looking at parents calling people by the sibling's name was like one of my first studies that actually wasn't an experiment. It was a questionnaire, but yeah, I'm usually just focused on behavior and don't get into things like genetics or even what part of the brain is doing what.
So yeah, if it can be tested, then you'll pull it in.
Yeah, I mean that's my go-to, but the danger with that is then in the lab you're creating an artificial situation so you can tell what exactly has an effect. So you're like, okay, I'm going to keep everything else constant and then just tweak this one variable, and if that has an effect, then I know that it's part of how things function in general. But often those things can be completely masked in like real life situations where you have all these different factors coming together, and that one little thing might be completely swamped by all these other influences. Which doesn't mean it's not important theoretically, but it just means that it just doesn't play a big role in real life. And one of the things you also want to do is be like, okay, well, to what extent are the things I'm studying kind of affecting real life? And so like the original work I did with eye movements was having people describe pictures on a computer screen. There's an experimenter sitting to the side, but basically they're kind of talking to themselves. And now with a student, we're looking at, we've gotten hold of eye tracking data from mothers just playing with your kids. Just free play with toys. And one of the nice things of showing that like the eye movements are basically the same during those interactions, which they might not have been, right? Because if you're talking to somebody, instead of just staring at and describing something on a screen, you are dividing your attention between maybe, the toy you're talking to. And, we know parents pay a lot of attention to their kids and what the kids are paying attention to. And so it was really nice to see that like the amount of time they spend looking at objects that they're talking to their kids about does reflect how difficult it is to come up with a name for the object, that doesn't get overwhelmed by looks to the child.
How difficult it is to come up with a name for the object for the child or for the
for the parent.
The parent.
Although interestingly, we also see that after so if like say the mother talks about a dog, or a more unfamiliar word like a lobster. After they say the word, the amount of time they look at the kid afterwards reflects how difficult that word was, which suggests that they are kind of like, maybe like, did you get that? Or
that's so interesting. Yeah. So they'll just look to double check. Say, a lobster is like, what's a lobster? I'm about to tell you what an ocean is too. Like, that's so interesting. Wow. No, it's fascinating to understand like all the different variables that could inform. I guess like just lab testing is so challenging in itself because you have to try and make it as, I guess, focused on like certain variables and eliminate as many as possible. Well, is there anything today that you wanted to discuss that we didn't touch on?
Actually, nothing comes to mind. I'm really impressed with how wide-ranging this conversation has been. A lot of fun.
Yeah, for me too. It was. There's so many cool things, and I think we covered maybe 90% of these questions and a couple ones on top of it. But thank you so much for taking the time to come in today. It was really nice to have this convo.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Amazing.